Hello and welcome to The Essential Reads. My name is Isaac, and my goal is to bring to you a bunch of classic audiobooks in an easy and accessible way. We are continuing with Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoyevsky, and this is Part 1, Chapter 6. Raskolnikov chanced subsequently to learn why the artisan and the peasant woman had invited Lizaveta to their home. The matter was of the most ordinary kind, and involved nothing particularly remarkable. A family from out of town who had landed in poverty was selling some of their belongings, clothes and the like. All of it women's stuff. Since selling things in the market never brought much profit, they were looking for a woman to do the selling for them elsewhere. This was the occupation Lizaveta had found for herself. She took commission, went here and there on business, and did a thriving trade, as she was very honest, and always asked the lowest price. Whatever price she named, that was the one at which she sold. As a rule, she said very little, and, as has already been remarked, was submissive and easily frightened. Recently, however, Raskolnikov had become superstitious. The traces of superstition were to remain in him for a long time afterwards, and he never really got rid of them. Indeed, in this whole affair, he was always subsequently inclined to perceive a certain strangeness and mystery, as if it involved the working of certain peculiar influences and coincidences. Back in the winter, a certain student he knew, by the name of Pokarev, had at one point during a conversation they had had, as the latter was about to depart for Kiev, slipped him Alyona Ivanovna's, the old woman's, address, in case he should need to pawn anything. For a long time he had held off going to see her, as he had his teaching and was managing to get by somehow. Some 6 weeks ago he had remembered about the address. He had 2 personal possessions that were suitable for pawning. One was the old silver watch he had inherited from his father, and the other was a small golden ring with 3 red stones of some description, which his sister had given to him at their parting as a keepsake. He decided to take the ring. Having tracked the old woman down, he felt towards her, at first glance, without as yet knowing anything in particular about her, an unmasterable sense of revulsion, took 2 tickets from her, and on his way looked in at a certain rather inferior little eating house. He ordered tea, sat down, and began to think very hard. A strange idea had popped up in his head, like a chicken broken from an egg, and he was finding it very, very absorbing. Sitting almost side by side with him at another table were a student whom he did not know at all, and whose face he did not remember, and a young officer. They had been playing billiards, and were now drinking tea. Suddenly he heard the student telling the officer about the pawnbroker Alyona Ivanovna, the collegiate secretary's widow, and giving him her address. This alone seemed somehow strange to Raskolnikov. There he was, having just come from there, and now the first people he met were talking about her. It was merely a coincidence, of course, but even so he was now unable to get rid of a certain very peculiar feeling, and now it was as if someone were doing his best to worm himself into his favour. The student had suddenly begun to tell his companion all sorts of details about this Alyona Ivanovna. "She's amazing," he was saying. "You can always get money out of her. She's as wealthy as a Jew. She could let you have 5,000 straight off, yet she won't turn her nose up even at the ruble pledge. A lot of us have been to see her. Only, she's a horrible old cow." And he began to relate how mean and capricious she was, how one needed only to be 1 day late in redeeming one's pledge for the thing to be lost. She would give 1/4 of the item's value, and take monthly interest of 5 and even 7%, and so on. The student got carried away, and informed his companion, moreover, that the old woman had a sister called Lizaveta, whom she, small and repulsive, beat every minute of the day, and kept in total bondage, like a child, while Lizaveta, at least 6 feet tall. "I mean, it's a real phenomenon," the student exclaimed, and burst into laughter. They began to discuss Lizaveta. The student talked about her with a peculiar satisfaction, and kept laughing, while the officer listened with great interest, and asked the student to send this Lizaveta over to mend some linen for him. Raskolnikov did not miss a single word, and learned everything in one go. Lizaveta was the old woman's younger half-sister. They had different mothers, and she was 35 years old. She worked for her sister day and night, performed the functions of cook and washerwoman in the household, and, in addition, did sewing, which she sold, and even sold herself out to scrub floors, giving all that she earned to her sister. She did not dare take a single order or accept a single job of work without the old woman's consent. Another thing was that the old woman had already made her will, a fact that was known to Lizaveta, who did not stand to inherit a single kopeck. Just the old woman's personal effects, some chairs, and so forth. All the money had been earmarked for distribution to a certain monastery in the province of N, in return for the eternal remembrance of her soul. Lizaveta had retained her petty bourgeois origins, unlike her sister, who had married into the civil service. She had not married, and was terribly awkward, of remarkable height, with great, long, almost bandy-looking legs. Always with down-at-heel goatskin shoes on her feet, and she paid especial attention to her personal cleanliness. The thing that the student found astonishing, and that made him laugh, however, was that Lizaveta was constantly pregnant. "But I thought you said she was a freak." "Well, she's sort of swazi. Like a soldier, dressed up, pretending to be a woman. But you know she's not at all a freak. She's such a kind face. Such kind eyes. Yes, really, she has. And the proof of this is that a lot of men find her attractive. She's a quiet sort, meek, mild, compliant. She'll go along with anything. And she has a really nice smile." "I say, do you find her attractive too?" The officer laughed. "Oh, only because she's so strange. No, but I'll tell you this. I'd murder that old woman and rob her of all her money. And I swear to you, I'd do it without the slightest twinge of conscience," the student added with heat. The officer burst out laughing again, and Raskolnikov started. How strange this was. "If you permit me, I'd like to ask you a serious question," the student said, growing excited. "I was joking just now, of course, but look. On the other hand, you have a nasty, stupid, worthless, meaningless, sick old woman who's no use to anyone and is, indeed, actually harmful to people, who doesn't even know herself why she is alive, and who's going to kick the bucket of her own accord tomorrow. Do you get my meaning? Do you?"
Yes, I think I do,"
the officer replied, fixing his eyes on his excited companion.
"Listen to this then. There, on the other hand, you have young, fresh energies that are going to waste for want of backing. Thousands of people are involved, and it's happening everywhere. 100, 1,000 good deeds and undertakings that could be arranged and expedited with that old woman's money, which is doomed to go to a monastery. Hundreds, possibly even thousands of lives that could be set on the right road. Dozens of families safe from poverty, breakup, ruin, depravity, the venerable hospitals, and all of that with her money. If one person were to kill her and take her money, in order with its help to devote oneself to the service of all mankind and the common cause, what do you think? Wouldn't one petty little crime like that be atoned for by all those thousands of good deeds? Indeed, instead of one life, thousands of lives rescued from corruption and decay. One death to 100 lives. I mean, there's arithmetic for you. And anyway, what does the life of that horrible, stupid, consumptive old woman count for when weighed against the common balance? No more than the life of a louse, a cockroach. And it's not even worth that, because the old woman is harmful. She's wearing another person's life out. She's mean. She bit Lizaveta's finger out of meanness the other day. She very nearly severed it. "Of course she doesn't deserve to live," the officer observed. "But then that's nature." "Ah, but it's possible to correct and channel nature, you know, old man. Otherwise, we would all drown in a sea of prejudice. If it weren't for that, there would never have been a single great man. People say duty, conscience. Well, I won't say a word against duty and conscience. But after all, what do we mean by them? Wait, I want to ask you another question. Listen." "No, I want to ask you a question first. You listen." Well, Here you are, talking and holding forth in that oratorical way of yours. But tell me,
Are you going to kill the old woman?
Of course not. I merely thought it would be her just desserts. It's no business of mine.
Well, the way I see it is that there are no just desserts in it at all unless you're prepared to do it yourself. Let's go and have another game. Raskolnikov was in a state of extreme excitement. All of this was, of course, the most commonplace and most frequently encountered kind of conversation. Many times before had he heard the same ideas expressed by young people in other forms and in relation to other subjects. But why had he chanced to hit upon such talk and such ideas precisely now, when inside his own head there had just been engendered precisely those same thoughts? And why precisely now, when he had only just come away from the old woman with the embryo of his idea, should he immediately have happened upon a conversation about her? This coincidence always seemed to him a strange one. This trivial eating-house conversation had an extremely strong influence on him during the subsequent development of the affair. As though here, some form of predestination, of augury, had been at work. Returning from the Haymarket, he threw himself on the sofa, and sat there for a whole hour with no movement. Meanwhile, it grew dark. He had no candle, and indeed the notion of lighting one never entered his head. Later, he could never remember whether he had been thinking about anything during that time. At last, he felt a return of his earlier fever and shivering, and realized, with pleasure, that it was possible to lie down on the sofa too. Before long, a sound, leaden sleep descended on him, seeming to press him down. He slept for an unusually long time, and had no dreams. Nastasia, when she came into his room at 10 o'clock the next morning, was hardly able to rouse him. She had brought him tea and bread. The tea was again weak stuff, made with used leaves, and was again served in her own teapot.
The way he sleeps,
she exclaimed indignantly.
It is nothing but sleep either.
With an effort, he raised himself. His head was aching. He got to his feet, turned round once in his room, and fell back on the sofa again.
Sleeping again?
Nastasia exclaimed.
Are you ill, or what? Do you want your tea?
Later, he said with an effort, closing his eyes again and turning his face to the wall. Nastasia went on standing over him for a bit.
Maybe he really is ill,
she said, turned away, and went out of the room. She came back again at 2 o'clock with some soup. He was lying as he had been earlier. The tea stood untouched. Nastasia actually took offence and began to push him and shove him with spite.
What are you always snoozing away there for?
She exclaimed, looking at him with revulsion. He raised himself on one elbow and sat up, but said nothing to her and merely looked at the floor.
Are you ill or aren't you?
Nastasia asked, but again she received no reply.
You want to get out for a bit,
she said after a pause.
It would do you good to get some fresh air. Are you going to have this food or what?
Later, he said weakly. Go away. And he made a motion with his hand. She stood there a bit longer, looked at him compassionately, and then went out. A few moments later he raised his eyes and gave the tea and the soup a long stare. Then he took the bread and the spoon and began to eat. He hardly touched the food, had no appetite, took only 3 or 4 spoonfuls in an absent-minded sort of way. His head was aching less now. Having had all he wanted, he stretched out on the sofa again, but was unable to get back to sleep, and lay there without moving, on his front, with his face thrust into the pillow. He kept on having walking fantasies, and they were all such strange ones. Most frequently of all, he fancied he was somewhere in Africa, in some kind of Egyptian oasis. A caravan was resting. The camels were lying down peacefully. All around there were palm trees, an entire circle of them. Everyone was eating their evening meal. He, however, kept drinking water, straight from the spring that flowed murmuring right by his side. It was so cool, and the water was so wonderfully, wonderfully cold and blue, hurrying over various coloured stones, and sand that was so pure, with spangles of gold. Suddenly, he distinctly heard the sound of a clock striking. He started, snapped out of his trance, raised his head, looked out of the window, figured what time it was, and suddenly leapt up, in full possession of his senses now, as though someone had hauled him off the sofa. He went over to the door on tiptoe, softly opened it a little way, and began to listen on the stairs. His heart was beating terribly, but on the staircase all was quiet, as if everyone were asleep. It seemed wild and improbable to him that he could have spent since yesterday in such oblivion without yet having done anything or made any preparations. And that might have been 6 o'clock striking just now. And suddenly, an extraordinary, feverish, and somehow helpless turmoil seized hold of him, in place of his slumber and torpor. There were, in fact, a few preparations to be made. He strained all his energies in order to think of everything, and leave nothing out. But his heart kept beating and beating, thumping so badly that he began to find it difficult to breathe. The first thing he had to do was make a loop and sew it to his coat, the work of a moment. He felt under his pillow, and retrieved from the pile of linen he had stuffed underneath it one of his shirts, which was practically falling apart, old and unwashed. From its rags he tore off a ribbon-like strip about 2 inches wide and 16 inches long. He folded this strip in two, took off his wide, tough fabric summer coat, the only outdoor garment he possessed, and began to sew both ends of the strip to the inside of its left armpit. His hands shook as he sewed, but he managed to do it, and in such a way that from the outside nothing was visible when he put the coat back on. The needle and thread he had procured long ago, and he kept them in his bedside table, wrapped up in a piece of paper. As for the loop, it was a very ingenious device of his own design. The loop was intended to hold an axe. It was out of the question to go out in the streets with an axe in one's hand. Even if one were to hide it under one's coat, one would still have to keep it in place with one's arm, which would be noticeable. Now, with the loop, however, all he had to do was put the head of the axe through it, and it would hang conveniently under his arm, on the inside of the coat, all the way there. And by putting his hand into one of the side pockets, he could hold on to the handle of the axe to stop it from dangling about. And since, too, the coat was a very roomy one, a veritable sack, no one would be able to see from the outside that he was holding on to something through the lining of his pocket. This loop was also something he had devised earlier, some 2 weeks previously. Having finished with this, he thrust his fingers into the narrow slit between his Turkish sofa and the floor, felt about in the left-hand corner, and pulled out the pledge he had manufactured and hidden there a long time ago. This pledge was, in fact, not really a pledge at all, just a smoothly planed piece of wood, no larger or thicker than the average cigarette case. He had found this piece of wood on one of his walks, one wing of which housed some workshop or other. Later, he added a thin, smooth iron plate. It had probably broken off something else, which he had also found in the street that same day. Fitting the two objects together, the iron one was smaller than the wooden one. He bound them firmly to each other, crosswise, by means of a length of thread. Then he wrapped them neatly and presentably in a sheet of clean, white paper, and tied the parcel with a slender ribbon. Also crosswise, adjusting the knot in such a manner that it would be rather difficult to undo. This was so that the old woman's attention would be distracted for a time. While she was fiddling with the knot, he would seize the moment. He had added the iron plate for the sake of some extra weight, so that the old woman would not at once guess that the item was made of wood. All this he had been keeping under his sofa until the time came. No sooner had he retrieved the thing than he suddenly heard a shout down in the yard somewhere.
It struck 6 o'clock long ago!
Long ago?
Oh my God.
He rushed to the door, listened, snatched up his hat, and began to descend his 13 steps, cautiously, inaudibly, like a cat. A most important part of the business still lay ahead. He had to steal an axe from the kitchen. That the deed had to be done with an axe was something he had decided long ago. He had also had a folding garden knife, but he had no confidence in the knife, and still less in his own strength. That was why he finally decided that he must use an axe. It may, incidentally, be worth noting here one peculiar feature of all this final decisions he had so far taken in this affair. They had all one strange characteristic. The more final they had grown, the more monstrous and absurd they at once became to his eyes. In spite of the entire agonizing inner struggle he went through, never for one instant was he able to believe in the feasibility of his intentions during that whole time. And even if it were somehow come to pass that he managed to work everything out, make all his decisions watertight down to the last detail, leaving no room for a single doubt, even then he would have turned his back on the whole thing as something absurd, outrageous, impossible. There remained, however, a whole host of unresolved points and questions that still had to be dealt with. As for how he was going to get hold of an axe, that trivial question did not trouble him in the slightest, because there was nothing easier. The fact was that Nastasia was hardly ever home, and this was especially true in the evenings. She was either going off to see the neighbors or running down to the corner shop, and she always left the door wide open. That was the very thing the landlady kept having those quarrels with her about. So, all he had to do when the time came was to go quietly into the kitchen and take the axe, and then, an hour later, when it was all over, come in once more and put it back. There were, however, certain imponderables. Supposing he were able to return an hour later in order to put the axe back, only to find that Nastasia, too, had returned. Then, of course, he would have to go past and wait until she had gone out again. But what if she were to notice that the axe had gone, and begin to look for it and raise a hue and cry? There would be suspicions, or at least grounds for suspicion. But these were merely trivial considerations, to which he did not even begin to give any thought. And indeed, he had not the time to do so. He was thinking about what was most important. The detail could wait until he was finished with everything. This latter condition did really seem unrealizable, however. At least, that was how it appeared to him. There was no way, for example, that he could ever imagine bringing his ratiocinations to an end, getting up and simply going there. Even his recent rehearsal, the visit he had made with the intention of making a final survey of the place, had only been an attempt at a rehearsal, not a real one. Much as if he had said, "Come on, I'll go and test it out. What's the point of lying here dreaming?" And had at once been unable to go through with it. Had shrugged his shoulders and run away in a bitter rage at himself. Yet at the same time, he had the feeling that, so far as the moral aspects of the question were concerned, his analysis was now complete. His casuistry had been whetted sharp as a razor, and he was unable to find any more conscious objections within himself. In the last resort, however, he simply had no faith in himself, and obstinately, slavishly sought objections right, left, and centre, fumbling around for them as though someone were compelling him and drawing him to it. But now this latest day, which had dawned so unexpectedly, and had decided everything, acted on him in an almost entirely mechanical fashion. As though someone had taken him by the hand and pulled him along behind him. Inexorably, blindingly, with unnatural force, countenancing no objection. As though a corner of his clothing had got caught in the flywheel of a machine, and he was beginning to be drawn into it. At first, this had actually been a long time earlier, a certain question had preoccupied him. Why were nearly all crimes so easily tracked down and found out? And why did the traces of nearly all criminals show up so clearly? Little by little, he'd arrived at certain diverse and interesting conclusions, and in his opinion, the principal cause was to be found less in the criminal's lack of ability to conceal the material evidence of his crime than it was in the criminal himself. It was the criminal himself who, in almost every case, became subject at the moment of his crime to a kind of failure of will and reason, and which were replaced by childish and phenomenal frivolity. And this, right at the very moment when the things that were needed most of all were reason and caution. According to the way he saw it, this ellipse of reason and failure of will attacked human beings like an illness, developing slowly and reaching their crisis not long before the enactment of the crime. According to the way he saw it, this ellipse of reason and failure of will attacks human beings like an illness, developing slowly and reaching their crisis not long before the enactment of their crime. They continued to manifest themselves in the same critical fashion at the moment of the crime itself, and also for a short time thereafter, depending on the individual. Then they passed, in the same way that every illness passes. On the other hand, the question of whether it was an illness that gave rise to the crime, or whether the crime itself was, by its own peculiar nature, invariably accompanied by something resembling an illness, was one that he did not yet feel able to determine. Arriving at such conclusions, he decided that where he personally was concerned in his own undertaking, there could be no such morbid upheavals, and that his reason and his will would remain inalienably with him throughout the entire enactment of what he had planned, for the sole reason that what he had planned was not a crime. We shall omit the lengthy process by which he arrived at this last conclusion. We have run too far ahead even as it is. We shall merely add that in general, the factual, purely material difficulties of the undertaking played a decidedly secondary role within his mind. As long as I can manage to preserve my will and my reason and exercise them over to the fullest extent, then they in turn will all be vanquished when it becomes necessary for them to acquaint themselves with the very last microscopic detail of the affair. But the affair was not making any progress. He continued to have not the slightest faith in his final decision. And when the fatal hour struck, everything turned out not that way at all, but somehow unexpectedly. Even, one might say, astonishingly. A circumstance of the most trivial kind landed him in an impasse before he had even got to the bottom of the stairs. As he drew level with his landlady's kitchen, the door to which, as always, stood wide open, he directed a cautious, disapproving look inside, in order to find out in advance whether Nastasia, being absent, the landlady was there, or, if she was not, whether the door to her room was properly shut. He did not want her peeping out of there when he went for the axe. Great, however, was his amazement when he suddenly saw that not only was Nastasia home and in her kitchen, but she was actually doing some work. She was taking the laundry out of its basket and hanging it on the clothesline. At the sight of him, she stopped what she was doing, turned towards him, and continued to stare at him steadily all the time he was passing. He averted his eyes and continued his descent, as though he had not noticed anything. But the whole affair was at an end. He had no axe. He was horribly shaken. Now where did I get that idea? He thought, as he was going through the entranceway. Where did I get the idea that she'd be bound to be out just then? Why was I so certain of it? Why? He felt crushed, and even in some way humiliated. He wanted to jeer at himself with malicious pride. A slow-witted, animal rage seethed up inside him. He paused in the entranceway in order to reflect. To go out onto the street like this, for show, as if he were taking a walk, was a prospect he found repugnant. The thought of going back to his room was one still more repugnant. What a chance I've lost forever, he muttered as he stood, shorn of purpose, in the entranceway right opposite the yard-keeper's little cubicle, the door to which also stood open. Suddenly he gave a start. From the little room, which was only 2 yards away from him, his eyes caught a glint of something underneath a bench on the right. He looked round him. No one. On tiptoe he approached the yard-keeper's room, went down the 2 little steps, and called the yard-keeper in a faint voice. As I thought, he's not at home. But he must be somewhere nearby in the yard, because the door is wide open. He pounced headlong on the axe. It was an axe. Dragging it out from under the bench where it lay between 2 logs, and, right there and then, while it was still inside, fastened it to his loop, stuck both hands in his pocket, and stepped out of the cubicle again. no one had noticed anything. If reason won't, the devil will, he thought, smiling a strange, ironic smile. This stroke of fortune had thoroughly revived his spirits. He continued on his way quietly and sedately, without hurry, in order to not give rise to any suspicion. He paid little attention to the passers-by, making a great effort not to look at them in the face at all, and to be as inconspicuous as possible. Then he remembered he was wearing his hat. For God's sakes! I even hid some money the day before yesterday, yet I didn't go and buy a cap instead. A curse erupted from his soul. Glancing casually out of one eye into a little shop, he saw that the clock on the wall inside said 7:10. He would have to hurry, and at the same time make a detour, approach the house by a roundabout route from the other side. Previously, whenever he had the occasion to picture all this to himself in his imagination, he had sometimes thought that he would be very afraid. But he was not particularly afraid now. Indeed, he was not afraid at all. At the present moment, he was actually preoccupied by some totally irrelevant thoughts, though they did not last for long. On his way past Yusupov Park, he even began to be thoroughly taken up with an imaginary project of his own devising. The construction of tall fountains, and the way in which they would probably refresh the air on all the city squares. Little by little, he moved on to the conviction that if the summer garden were to be extended the entire length of the Field of Mars, and even possibly connected with the gardens of the Mikhailovsky Palace, this would be an attractive improvement that would also be of the benefit to the city. At this point, he suddenly began to develop an interest in the questions of why it was that in all great cities, people seemed to be especially inclined to live and settle in precisely those parts of town where there were no gardens or fountains, where there were dirt and foul smells and all kind of filth, and that this was not really caused by material necessity. Here he recalled his own walks in the Haymarket, and for a moment he snapped out of his trance. What a load of nonsense, he thought. God, I'd do better not think at all. I suppose this must be how men who are being led to the scaffolding cling with their thoughts to all things that they meet along the way. This notion flashed across his mind, but it was only a flash, like lightning. He suppressed it as quickly as possible. But now he was close. Here was the house. Here were the gates. Somewhere a clock beat a single chime. But is it really 7:30? That's impossible. It must be fest. To his good fortune, everything went without incident at the gates again. Not only that, but at that very moment, as if by design, a cart carrying an enormous load of hay was in the process of entering the gate in front of him, completely shielding him from view the whole time he was walking through the entranceway. The instant the cart had succeeded in maneuvering through the gate into the yard, he slipped through to the right. Over there, on the other side of the hay cart, several voices could be heard shouting and talking. But no one observed him, and he encountered no one either. Many of the windows that looked onto this enormous quadrangular courtyard were open at that moment, but he did not raise his head. He had not the strength. The staircase that led up to the old woman's apartment was close by, just inside the gateway to the right. He was already on the stairs. Pausing for a breath, and pressing one hand against his thumping heart, then feeling about for the axe and setting it straight again, he began carefully and quietly to ascend the staircase, straining his ears to every moment. But at that particular time, the staircase was quite deserted. All the doors were shut. No one was about. True, the door to one empty apartment on the second floor was wide open, and some decorators were at work inside painting, but they paid him no attention. He stood still for a moment, thought, and then continued his ascent. Of course, it would have been better if nobody had been here at all, but there are 2 more floors above them. Now here was the 4th floor. Here was the door, and there was the apartment opposite, the empty one. To judge by all the signs, the apartment on the 3rd floor, the one right underneath the old woman's flat, was also empty. The visiting card that had been fixed to the door with nails had been taken down. The other people had moved out. He was panting. For a single instant there passed through his head the thought, Shouldn't I just go away? But he left his own question unanswered and began listening at the old woman's door. Dead silence. Then he listened on the stairs again, listened long and carefully. After that, he looked round one last time, pulled himself together, straightened himself up, and again tested the axe in its loop. Don't I look terribly pale? He thought. Don't I look awfully agitated? She's suspicious. Shouldn't I wait a bit more until my heart has quieted down? But his heart did not quiet down. On the contrary, as if by design, it proceeded to beat harder and harder and harder. But he could not endure it. Slowly he stretched his hand out to the bell and rang it. Half a minute later he rang it again, slightly louder this time. No reply. It was pointless to go on ringing to no purpose, and besides, it might attract attention. The old woman was at home, of course, but she was suspicious and alone. He knew something of her habits. And again he put his ear firmly to the door. Whether it was that his senses were extraordinarily keen, which on the whole was unlikely, or whether each sound really was very audible, he suddenly thought that he could make out the cautious whisper of a hand on the latch, and the rustle of a dress immediately on the other side of the door. Someone was standing imperceptibly right by the lock, just as he was out here, keeping quiet inside, and apparently also putting an ear to the door. He purposely made a movement and muttered something in rather a loud voice, so as to not make it seem he was acting furtively. Then he rang a third time, but quietly, sedately, and without a hint of impatience. When he remembered it later, in clear and vivid detail, this moment was chiselled within him forever. He could not think where he had got so much cunning from. All the more so as his mind had been subject to momentary blackouts, and he had hardly been conscious of his body at all. A moment later, the sound of someone undoing the bolt was heard. Thank you so very much for listening. If you enjoyed, please like, comment, share, all that jazz, and if you really enjoyed, do subscribe, because there is more to come. My word, this book is incredible. If you're listening on podcast, please leave a review. That helps get in front of as many people as possible, and reading your reviews really makes my day. You can now leave comments also on Spotify. Also, if you want to listen to Spotify, just, I don't know, while you're sleeping, and help me get some of those delicious, delicious listening hours on Spotify, they've now added monetization options for Europe, the place that I live in, so I could get paid for podcast platforms as well, which would be very, very nice. So if you want to do that and support me, that would be great. If you want to support the show in another way, you can click up here to the Ko-Fi link, which is now on screen, or you can find the same link in the description box. It's just an extra way to help the show, help me, improve this space, improve my microphone, improve my life. I don't know. My God, this book is... I'm only 100 pages in. I know, we're on chapter 6, and it's already at 100... I think it's page 92, but still. This book is amazing. I hope you're enjoying it as much as I am. I'm finding it so just incredibly well written. So good. And for me, who sometimes has difficulty reading, especially with the last book, my God, Wuthering Heights was challenging for me. But this is just written in a way that flows so well and so easy to read, and the descriptions are beautiful, and the characters are so well written, and oh my God, everything is just great. I'm loving this book. I really hope you're enjoying it as much as me, because we're going to be doing this for another 500 plus pages. So I hope you are. Once again, thanks for listening, and until next time, bye-bye.